Minister of State for Energy and Clean Growth. Minister of State Claire Perry.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I would like to make a statement on the current climate change protest and on our climate change policy. I apologise to members of the House if we're covering ground we covered extensively earlier, but I think it is a subject that will bear as much scrutiny as we care to give it. Mr. Speaker, colleagues will be aware that the public concern about climate change has grown to levels never seen before, and in recent weeks it has been incredibly powerful to see people of all generations across the world voicing their concerns about a warming climate and demanding a response, a global response to this global crisis. Madam Deputy Speaker, we've heard loud calls today that we should declare a climate emergency. And my answer to that is that we can say words all we like from the dispatch box. What counts is actions. And what I would hope to set out is the many actions that we are taking that have enjoyed cross-party support, and my fervent hope that we will continue to tackle this enormous crisis in that spirit going forward. There is no doubt that climate change is the most profound environmental challenge facing the world today, and where more action is urgently needed. We shouldn't shy away from that fact. We must recognise the fact. We, I think, should welcome the strong and growing pressure for more action to cut our emissions, but we should also ensure that while we acknowledge the scale of the challenge ahead, we do try as hard as we can to build a consensus around change so that communities across the UK and indeed across the world feel secure, feel optimistic and feel involved in our shifts to decarbonise the economy. As I said earlier today, I think we should be talking about hope, not fear, communicating the progress that we have made globally and we have made here in the UK, which does demonstrate that this urgent action to decarbonise economy can sit alongside comfortably opportunity and growth and employment going forward. And we entirely accept, and I accept, that concerted action, more action at national and international level is urgently required. But I still feel that we must focus on the fact, because it shows that it is possible, that we have shown real leadership in the UK thanks to the cross-party consensus we have forged on this since the passage of our world-leading Climate Change Act over a decade ago. I want to update colleagues on this progress and to outline priorities moving forward. And again, forgive me if I cover some of the ground that we covered extensively earlier. In 2008, we were the first country to introduce legally binding long-term emissions reductions target. The Right Honourable Gentleman, Member for Doncaster North, was very instrumental in bringing that legislation forward, but it did enjoy strong cross-party support. And the Climate Change Act, for me, has been an absolutely seminal piece of legislation, because while I have one of the few ministers in the world who stands here with high ambition and high aspiration and a legally binding set of budgets that we have to report on to Parliament, it is a great way of ensuring climate action survives the political cycle. And it has delivered. Since 1990, as many members will know, we have cut our emissions in the UK by 42%, whilst growing the economy by 72%. We are independently assessed as leading the G20 in decarbonisation since the year 2000. And people do talk a lot about the disparity between territorial emissions and consumption emissions. And I would invite members to consider the latest data that shows that our greenhouse gas emissions on a consumption basis fell by 21% between 2007 and 2016. Indeed, they fell 6% year on year in the year to 2016. Well, it is true, that is the data, and I'd be very happy to write to all members and share it with them. Well, again, I'd be very happy to write to the Honourable Gentleman with the data and copy in Ms Thunberg. Across the UK, almost 400,000 people are working in low-carbon jobs and their supply chains, a sector that is bigger than aerospace and is growing at a factor of 2 or 3 times the mainstream economy. And, of course, we have continued to be active on the international stage. My right honourable friend, the member for Hastings, was the minister who carried the baton at the Paris climate change talks, which were so instrumental in coming together, as the world had done previously in the Montreal Protocol, to show that there is concerted international support and action for tackling these enormous international challenges. And at the COP24 in Poland last December, in Katowice, a city where you could taste the hydrocarbons on the air. That's what happens when you burn coal. It must have been what London was like in the 1950s. We in the UK, and I pay tribute to my excellent officials, helped drive the work of progressive groups and secured global agreement on a robust rule book that brings the Paris Agreement to life. If you can't measure it, Madam Deputy Speaker, you can't manage it. And we are continuing to take targeted and impactful actions to support ambition internationally through promoting global alliances and collaborations, from the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which now has over 80 members, like the UK, committed to rapidly ending the use of coal as a source of electricity generation, to the Carbon Neutrality Coalition. Madam Deputy Speaker, I was asked frequently this afternoon, what are some of the things you've done in the last 6 months? So I thought I would focus on a few choice morsels to share with colleagues. Colleagues will be, I'm sure, sick of me waving the Clean Growth Strategy around, which is published, but I'm going to continue to do it in November 2017, because I believe it is one of the most comprehensive documents any government has put out across the world, detailing how we will take decarbonisation action across the economy. To date, we have taken action on the vast majority of those actions. And to highlight some, only last month I launched the offshore wind sector deal, including a £250 million growth partnership with investors to ensure that we will continue to invest in the North Sea, the best place in the world for offshore wind. But we will crucially drive up the UK content of that nascent industry to over 60%, and we will ensure the industry employs at least 30% women by the year 2030. This is an industry that is regenerating communities across our coastal communities right around the UK, and it's one where we absolutely lead the world, and will continue to do so. In the spring statement, the Chancellor introduced the Future Home Standard, which said that all new homes will be required to have low carbon heating systems and world-leading levels of energy efficiency by 2025, something that will radically transform house building in constituencies like mine, where most homes are not connected to the gas grid. He also announced that we will increase the proportion of green gas used in the grid in a bid to drive down the carbon profile of the hard-to-decarbonise heating network. Only this Easter weekend, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've had the longest run ever in this country of no coal contributing to power generation on this grid. When many of us were elected to this House, coal contributed 40% of our electricity to a system, and it is a testament to our own unilateral policies, including a carbon tax and emissions targets, that has led us to do something utterly transformational that other European countries have been unable so far to replicate. We also continue to contribute internationally. We are one of the largest donors of international facing overseas development assistance. Over £6 billion committed in this Parliament, and in January the UK Climate Investments announced almost £30 million of investment in a dedicated African renewable energy company trying to make projects marketable and investable in so much of the developing world, so those countries never have to go through a high carbon stage in their growth cycle. And it's not just the Bays, it is right across government. We've published the ambitious 25-year environment plan. We've kick-started the creation of a vast northern forest which will see 50 million trees planted from Liverpool to Hull. Tree planting is one of the most cost-effective ways to sequester carbon and improve soil conditions, as I know colleagues will know. And our new resources and waste strategy outlines steps to reform the packaging producer responsibility system, introducing deposit return schemes and food waste collection schemes. Now, we should celebrate these actions, but we have not to imply that we are in any way complacent, and not to suggest that we don't need to go very much more rapidly and further, but to demonstrate that this is a win-win both for the planet and also for future generations in terms of their jobs and prosperity. And as colleagues will know, we celebrated last year our first ever Green Great Britain Week, and I can announce to the House tonight that we will be continuing this process with the new annual week returning for the second year on the 4th of November this year, and we look forward to the celebrations and also the challenges around that. So we've also, however, not shied away from the responsibility going forward, and that's why we were the first industrial economy after the publication of the chilling IPCC 1.5 degree report to ask our own Committee on Climate Change for advice on our long-term targets, particularly on a net zero target. And I'm looking forward to receiving their advice on the 2nd of May, and will engage with colleagues across this House on our next steps in the light of this. It's worth pointing out, Madam Deputy Speaker, the last time we asked for this advice, the committee told us it wasn't feasible to do either from a technological or a cost point of view, so it will be extremely interesting to see what has changed and how we can rise to that challenge. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have the utmost respect for those who are pushing for stronger action to address the risk of uncontrolled climate change. The right to protest peacefully is a long-standing tradition in this country and a vital foundation of our democracy, and it has been good to see that the demonstrations have by and large been good-natured and the policing response has been sensible and proportionate. I welcome the passion and fervour of the protesters and their constant reminder to us of the duties we face in raising our eyes from the next few years of the conversation about, I don't know, our relationship with Europe and thinking about the long-term challenges that we face. And I hope that those who have taken their passion public will continue to express their views without disrupting the daily lives of ordinary people or without endangering the safety of the public, and also without undermining the consensus that I so strongly believe we will need to support further, bolder action. We must work together to solve this challenge of climate change in this House, in the other place, in classrooms across the UK, in boardrooms across the UK, in international negotiating huddles, in homes and throughout civil society to deliver the broad, just and progressive action on climate change that we urgently need.
Very good.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Mr. Speaker today has graciously allowed the earlier urgent question and this statement both on climate change. That, in my remembrance, is absolutely unique, but I think it's also uniquely appropriate given the visit of Greta Thunberg to the House earlier today. And so through you, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to pass my thanks to Mr. Speaker for doing that. In our earlier discussion, we focused almost exclusively upon emissions reduction and energy policy. So I'd like to start by asking the Minister to enlighten the House about those other aspects of our climate change policy that received less attention. Let's start with the National Adaptation Plan. The Minister will know that of the 56 climate risks and opportunities identified by the Committee on Climate Change, 27 of them simply do not feature in the government's plan. Why no word on the transition for flood-affected areas ahead of the withdrawal of flood re? Why nothing in relation to the dangers to elderly health from an overheating in the summer? Even where targets are set, there is a record of failure. The woodland cover target calls for 5,000 hectares of new plantation every year. So why is the rate so far only 1,500 hectares, less than a third? Has the Minister examined the work of Professor Ian Bateman about the differential natural capital values of such plantation depending on its location in relation to urban areas? And what account is she taking of this? Over the last 2 years, increasingly frequent severe weather events have cost our economy £1.5 billion a year. In 2016, the government acknowledged the increased risk of flooding and coastal erosion. The government accepted the current levels of adaptation were inadequate. It promised to update its flooding and coastal erosion management strategy by 2019. 2019 is here. Where is the updated strategy? We naturally focus on the impacts of human communities, but the impact on our biodiversity is devastating. It's only through a coherent and comprehensive network of protected areas that our biodiversity will not suffer further loss. So what does the government's climate strategy do to restore the 50% cuts since 2010 to the income of Natural England, who are responsible for monitoring and maintaining that very network? The Minister said in her response to the urgent question this afternoon that she doesn't see the value of simply declaring a climate emergency. It is this. It tells the truth. And on emissions reduction, The truth is that we are making some progress. I acknowledge that. I welcome that. But the honest truth is that we're not making progress fast enough. The government's own statistics show that. The fourth carbon budget is set at a limit of 1,950 megatons of CO2 equivalent a year. A limit of that. But current policies are off track, projecting an overshoot of 5.6%. Now, to counteract that overshoot, we'll have to reduce emissions even further during the fifth carbon budget period. Because of that overshoot, we'll need to reduce emissions by 334 megatons. Current policies leave us only half of the way between where we expected to be at the end of the fourth carbon budget and where we need to be by the end of the fifth. The government has rightly now asked the Committee on Climate Change for its advice on reaching net zero emissions, and I welcome the Minister's assurance earlier today that she will bring the government's response back to this House expeditiously. But the point I'd make very gently to the Minister is this. If you are already off track to meet your existing targets, then you need urgent action to get us anywhere close to meeting net zero. Earlier, the Minister spoke of cross-party support on climate change. It already exists. The Labour Party, the Green Party, the Lib Dems, the SNP and Ploughed all agreed that we need to declare a climate emergency. We would love it if the Conservatives joined us. Will she? If we are to stand any chance of winning the battle against climate change, we must work together over the decades ahead to ensure that we're cutting our greenhouse gas emissions at the scale and pace demanded by the science. Labour has already committed to enshrining a net zero emissions target in law, so have a number of other parties. Indeed, over 190 members of this House joined together in a remarkable display of cross-party support for climate action in signing a letter championed by the member for Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland asking the government to adopt a net zero target. So will the Minister commit today to taking whatever action the Committee on Climate Change recommends when it publishes that report and to enshrining the new net zero target into law? And if the Minister were to fully accept the recommendations that the Committee on Climate Change put forward, I give her this commitment. We on the Labour benches will work as closely as possible with her and all colleagues across this House to ensure that we can get a net zero climate target passed into law before the summer recess. As the climate protesters have told us, time is of the essence and we cannot afford to let this important piece of legislation delay any longer than strictly necessary. The clean growth strategy that is supposed to meet those budgets is simply not fit to do so. And once we've enshrined for a net zero target, the clean growth strategy will be out of date. Will the Minister agree, therefore, that we need a new, more ambitious strategy? There is no shame in recognising that.
The Honourable Gentleman has exceeded his time, but I was going to allow him to conclude rather than to cut him off immediately.
Very gracious, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've tried not to exceed the time that the Minister took.
The Honourable Gentleman misunderstands. The Minister has rather more time in a statement than the Opposition.
So, earlier the Minister spoke of the need to consider our international impacts. 97% of UK export finance support to energy in developing countries goes to fossil fuels, a subsidy to dirty, polluting energy worth nearly $5 billion. Will she look at that? We need even greater ambition and action if we're to inspire others in our bid to host next year's UN Climate Change Conference here in the UK, a bid which my party wholeheartedly will give the government support to achieve.
Minister.
Well, I see many colleagues standing, so I thank you, your Shadow Minister, for his commitment and his support to cross-party action. I wanted to answer some of his points. He raised rightly the question of the natural resources and the contribution they can play to carbon reduction. He will be pleased, I'm sure, to know that since 1990, emissions from that sector have halved. And he's absolutely right that there is more to do. They now only account for 15% of the the total emissions pie. And indeed, there have been some amazing efficiency improvements, and I do pay tribute to our farmers and to our innovative investors in this area. For example, it takes a third less CO2 to produce a kilo of pork than it did now than in 1990. But there is clearly more to do. He clearly points out, which is something he knows I agree with, which is we have to take a whole of economy approach to making these reductions. I will say to him what I said earlier, Madam Deputy Speaker, with regard to declaring net zero. The only way to ensure that the actions that we want to deliver actually can be delivered is to make sure when we set them out, they are fully understood, they are fully costed, and they are fully planned, and that we have buy-in from local authorities, from civil society, etc. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing the CCC's advice, but I will take the time that is required and work with whoever needs to be involved to ensure that when we set that target, it can actually be delivered. I do not want to be the minister that attempts to set out something very profound only for it to be hived off because of other pressures that might happen down the line. If we make that commitment, it must stick.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
Deputy Speaker, may I first of all congratulate my right honourable friend for her outstanding record in her department, and my right honourable friend, the member for Hastings, before her. And will she agree that one of the things that is essential in the grown-up discussion on climate change is that there should be a proper sense of proportion and understanding to what has been achieved and what needs to be achieved, which everyone agrees is of the first importance itself. But will my right honourable friend confirm that the United Kingdom has been amongst the most successful countries in the developed world in growing our economy, whilst at the same time reducing our emissions, and that in itself is a very important lesson for the future?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his comments. I'd also would like to pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for Ruislip Northwood, who did so much in this brief before I was lucky enough to take it on. He's absolutely right. A sense of proportion is hugely important. I can also go further and say that not only are we amongst the leaders, but according to independent research, we have led the G20 in decarbonising our economy, through looking at carbon intensity. Again, this is not to say there isn't more to do, it's to say that it can be done. It can be done in a way that doesn't jeopardise energy security, that doesn't put undue cost burdens on consumers or businesses, and we know there is more to do, but we should take hope from the progress that we have made.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and may I thank the Minister for sight of her statement a short time ago. I have to say, though, that this statement seems very empty and appears to be a case of saying something because she has something to say rather than because she has something to say. I mean, it is a reaction to the protests we've seen rather than a real plan for the future or any indication that there is a real plan for the future. Can I ask her, since there was no mention of it in her statement, where is the government's response to the report of the Green Finance Task Force? We were promised it in spring of this year. Surely there should have been at least some indication of this in this statement on the way forward. Where, too, is the response to the comments of the Governor of the Bank of England, warning of the economic risks of low-carbon transition? Will the government commit to creating a green and resilient pipeline of low-carbon projects? And will she clarify that institutional investors will be made responsible for limiting climate-related financial risks to pensions, savings and investments? In June last year, the Environmental Audit Committee warned of an alarming collapse in investment in renewable energy. And this morning she told us that wave and tidal power had been outcompeted for support. What is the government doing to address the low investment in renewables? And finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the UK is set to miss its emissions reduction targets under the Climate Change Act for the 4th carbon budget by 3 to 12% and for the 5th carbon budget by 6 to 20%. Will she commit the government to implementing the recommendations of its own Green Finance Task Force in full? And will she give that commitment commitment today?
Thank you, Madam. Mr Deputy Speaker, well, as I set up the Green Finance Task Force along with my honourable friend, the member for Salisbury, I am absolutely committed to bringing forward many of their proposals. Indeed, we have been making progress on their proposals. We are very lucky. Again, it's a source of great success for us that we have one of the most innovative financial capabilities in the world, and we are actually really capable of advancing progress in that area. For example, we've set up the Green Finance Institute, the Green Finance Strategy. There will be more detail coming forward. She raised the question about wave and tidal. I do just want to slightly clarify that it's a question of if we have a limited amount of money, how are we best to spend it to achieve the decarbonisation targets we want at best value to the taxpayers. We have spent, I believe, almost £60 million on innovation funding for wave and tidal. I will make sure those numbers are correct and write to the Honourable Lady if they're not. But we will also, and we look carefully at every proposal that has come forward, and I was very pleased to meet the Marine Energy Council working on a cross-party basis to see how we might do more to go forward. And finally, not to nitpick, but the Honourable Lady is quoting numbers around the budgets, which are simply not true. We are currently at 95% of where we need to be to meet CB4, which ends in 2027, and 93% of the way to meet CB5, which ends in 2032. And importantly, we have not. We are bringing forward policies and proposals all the time, including the proposals that were made in the Spring Statement, against which we have not done yet a CO2 accounting. And I am confident, as the House knows, that with the level of investment, with the level of focus, with the level of support, we will achieve these budgets. But that will not be enough to get us to a zero carbon emissions net target by 2050, which is why we will have to continue to innovate and invest.
Justin Green.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Obviously, the public sector's contribution to this is equally important, and I just wondered what the Minister has to say for companies like Zebra Fuels in my constituency that can play their part in bringing new technology on electric batteries to the public sector, but have actually found it quite hard to engage their more innovative approach with many different parts of the public sector.
Her Honourable Lady's constituents, Right Honourable Ladies, are finding it difficult to engage because actually leadership in the public sector, I think, is something where we can really demonstrate progress. And we've introduced a voluntary public sector emissions reduction target of 30%. We actually had overachieved on the central government estate on narrower targets. We've set up a new greenhouse gas reduction target of minus 43%. Of course, this also saves taxpayers money. And we have things like the Salix Finance Programme, which provides zero carbon funding through a revolving fund to ensure that the public sector can access funds where needed. And I would encourage all of us to make sure that our local authorities are aware of that fund. But if the Honourable Lady wants to send me any more information, I will certainly make sure that engagement happens.
Deputy Speaker, I want to ask the Minister about the global context to this. We've had 1 degree of warming already. Paris set the objective of 1.5 degrees, no more than 1.5 degrees of warming, but the Paris pledges add up, I think I'm right in saying, to about 2.7 degrees of warming, and we're off track on as a world, we're off track on the Paris commitments. I just wonder if the Minister can tell us what progress has been made since Paris on improving the pledges globally, because it seems to me very little progress has been made, and in the run-up to the COP in 2020, wherever it is hosted, and I hope we host it, what is the strategy to get there? Because I think people are partly out on the streets, not just because of the domestic context, but because they think 2 degrees is going to be a disaster and we're going to be well above 2 degrees. So that global context is vital.
The Right Honourable Gentleman makes a really profound point, and I'm not surprised given his experience, that whatever we do in the UK, however much we talk about our progress, it is an infinitesimal part of the current emissions profile. And I think 2 things have happened since Paris. The first is, I know it sounds very boring and dull, but actually developing a rule book so that we can actually look each other in the eye and hold each other to account on an agreed set of measurements is really important. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And secondly, I think the COP next year is going to be really important because that's when we actually show our nationally determined contributions, is when we will really be able to quantify on a like-for-like basis what the current emissions profile looks like. And I think it is incredibly important that it is a successful and ambitious COP. But I don't think we should forget how seminal it was to get 196 countries to agree even on that target and agree a process of working together. It's absolutely unprecedented. And my hope is that these protests and these conversations that are happening globally will be focusing ministers' minds right across the world so we can go into the 2020 COP and have a really successful outcome.
Thank you, Mr
Deputy Speaker, and I did listen Blue Peter style to the statement that the Minister made earlier, and I would really like to congratulate my right honourable friend on her bold assertion there is no planet B. So would she recognise the actions of institutional investors to save this planet, such as the Church Commissioners, who, as shareholders, require the companies in whom they invest to be compliant with the Paris Agreement, thus demonstrating the power of market forces to effect change?
Thank my right honourable friend for that question. It's been some of the most important meetings I've been lucky enough to have in this role have been with faith groups, because interfaith groups are working extremely well, setting their own targets and also using the significant power of their own investment might to effect change. And I think when we had our first Green Great Britain week, people say, what is something I can do? I've turned off my lights, I'm cycling a lot, I'm recycling. Actually, the most effective thing we can do, is to think hard about our pension funds, either through our own investments or through lobbying our trustees, such as the House of Commons trustees, because it is 27 times more effective to get an institutional investor to make the shift. And the good news is that is happening right across the world. We have amazing groups like the church groups doing it in the UK, but that is the power of market forces, and that will dwarf the amount of money that government is investing in this low-carbon transition.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to have supported the Climate Change Act, and I pay tribute to the leadership given by my right honourable friend, the member for Doncaster North. And the Minister's right, there's been progress by successive governments. But one area that is very challenging, and that's the built environment. Can she agree with me that more has to be done, particularly in England, because we on the Bay Select Committee are doing an inquiry, and the statistics are that the Welsh Government spends twice as much as the English Government, UK Government, Scotland 4 times, and Northern Ireland 1.5. Because if she keeps saying we need action, let's have action in this House by this government.
I think the gentleman makes a valuable point. I mean, the built environment can encompass homes, it can encompass buildings and transport. Actually, I think one of... Well, yeah, I know it good. What I was coming on to say was I think one of the most effective ways of influencing the built environment is actually at a local level, because I've been so struck by some of the ambition and progress that's been made by local authorities and combined local authorities right across the UK. Of course, government can set ambition and change regulations, but actually it is so much more powerful for a local authority to say, this is what we want to do, this is where the investment needs to go, and to design it themselves. And I've been particularly pleased on the homes environment with the announcement, as I mentioned earlier, that we will not be building homes relying on fossil fuel heating by 2025. Not only will that transform heating, but also it will recreate or improve the market conditions and drive down the cost of that technology.
I'm not sure what... I'm not... I am sure about something. I'm not entirely sure what is meant by declaring a climate emergency. As far as I'm concerned, that is a climate emergency. And the IPC report gives us 12 years to get this sorted out, which is a nanosecond in terms of climatic science. So, on one hand, we do need to scare the pants off our constituents about the changes that we need to make right across the economy, but it will only work if we carry them with us as well. So finger-pointing negativity just turns a tin ear by them in their busy lives. We need to make sure that we are mobilising the essential optimism of the British people about the opportunities for change which we know exist right across the economy.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right, and of course I think the point which I paid tribute to him earlier for is it's not just about the atmosphere, it's about our water courses, it's about our land use, it's the entire ecosystem. But we do have to focus on the opportunity here. I think so many people, when they hear, being scared that we've got 12 years to save the planet, which is a terrifying thought, think, well, what's the point? We can't possibly change anything. There's so much CO2 over there, we'll never get rid of it. And the point is we can change, we have changed, and we've done it in a way that has not impoverished people, has not interfered with our energy security. And actually energy bills have gone down, Mr Deputy Speaker, because energy efficiency in the home has increased. So these are myths that we must bust, and we need to take people with us as we make these changes.
When I met the young people from Cantley Willows Academy recently and received their petition, you can feel their frustration in what they're saying about climate change. They think we're sleepwalking to disaster. They think we need to wake up. They think this Parliament is asleep. What are we going to do about that? And can I say to the Minister, some of the language, I just ask her to reflect on some of the language she uses, because it sounds complacent. There are things the government have done, but we need to convey that sense of urgency, that sense of what we're going to do to get a move on before this world collapses and implodes on itself. And building on my honourable friend from Doncaster North, what are we going to do to bring the world together? Because this is a wake-up call for our own country, but for countries across the world, if we're going to avert the disaster which is staring us in the face.
Again, if there is any communication of complacency, then I'm horrified, because I think we have to calmly focus on the science which is there. This debate is so striking that we haven't had anybody stand up and say this is just a hoax and it's not happening. It's incredible. That didn't happen 10 years ago. There was almost universal acceptance of the challenge and the progress. But I think one of the things I hear from young people is, you've done nothing. Well, what does that say about what so many colleagues in this House have done for the last 10 years? Colleagues have done incredible things. They've supported huge changes to our energy system. When I was elected, 40% of our power came from coal. That over this Easter weekend it has been 0, and then it will be down to 0 completely by 2025. That is a huge achievement. So we must say to people, well, you're right to encourage us to do more, to be angry with us, but don't say we've done nothing. You all haven't been asleep at the wheel before we got here, and we certainly haven't been asleep at the wheel since then.
Okay. Robert Courts. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask the Minister to elaborate a little, please, on the reason why she also attaches the importance of a growing economy at the same time as tackling climate change? Because is it not the case that we will need to be able to invest in the technology that we are going to need in order to cut emissions further?
And I think one of the sort of challenges out there, which I have heard, is that we somehow need a fundamental reworking of the market-based system, and then we will solve all our problems. My recollection, Mr Deputy Speaker, is centrally planned economies historically had some of the worst records on environmental pollution and climate change emissions. And so to me, what I have seen is the power of the private sector investment that my honourable friend alluded to earlier, the technology and innovation that comes from competition, and the design of things like the auction system, and I do see the right honourable gentleman who was in my place, or in my honourable friend's place, who helped design that, which has had costs of offshore wind tumbling over the last years. So the market-based system does deliver, but you need government to set ambition, to regulate where required, and to convene where necessary.
Mary Crew.
Mr Deputy Speaker, it's very timely given that Marsden Moor outside Huddersfield and Ilkley Moor outside Bradford have been on fire, raging this weekend. Today there has been a machinery of government announcement where DEFRA is transferring greenhouse gas business emissions over to BEIS, and 12,000 companies will now report on that. In that new guidance, there are just 7 pages on water, 3 pages on waste, 2 on resource sufficiency and biodiversity, and woodland creation and the greenhouse gases associated with it has been relegated to 1 page in Annex K. Can I urge the Minister not to lose sight of the natural world, and when the new greening government commitments are made in 2020, can I ask that every department of government is properly accountable, because our audits have found that they are failing to meet it in both the policy sphere and in their own operations.
I pay tribute actually to the Honourable Lady and her committee. She knows that I and others are so very impressed with the work work that she does. She raises an important point. I think this whole of government approach is so valuable. We can no longer just point to a silo and say, if we solve that, that will solve the problem. We have to advance on all fronts, and I will look at what she has suggested that we review, and if it needs improvement, we will deliver it.
Rebecca Park.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Minister quite rightly outlined the very wide-ranging ways that we are decarbonising across all sectors, which is absolutely the right thing. But would she agree with me that better management of our soils could go a very long way to achieving many of our emissions targets, indeed getting to net zero sooner, if only we manage the soils better? And we have a great opportunity, Mr Deputy Speaker, to get this right through the 25-year Environment Plan, the Agriculture Bill and the Environment Bill, which is going to be the biggest piece of environmental legislation we've had since the Wildlife and Countryside Act. And it shows, doesn't it, Minister, that whilst we get the message about the crisis, we're hearing that, the way to put it right is through the policies.
Yeah, I agree. Can I pay tribute to my honourable friend's work on this topic, of which she is something of an expert? She had a very successful soil summit just before the recess, and I think again we have realised that some of the most cost-effective ways of sequestering carbon, like soil changes in land use management, soil improvements or forestation, are also those that are best for the natural environment. So I think we have all collectively realised how we need to continue to invest in these important areas.
Shedwood David.
Thanking the Minister for her kind words about the design of CFD auctions was to ensure that Britain is a world leader in offshore wind. Can I have to say to her, I found her statement rather Panglossian in the fact that renewable energy investment has fallen off a cliff in the last 2 years, and the major expansion in renewable investment really was about investment decisions made before 2015, which I have to say her former colleague, the Chancellor, George Osborne, tried to unpick directly after the 2015 election. And can I also refer her to the point made by the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Doncaster North and in the linking to the Paris Climate Change Treaty? Does she not accept that it was Britain's leadership in the European Union on climate change, leading to very ambitious targets adopted by the heads of state of the EU in October 2014, that led to the Americans and the Chinese being more ambitious on climate change, and there to the Paris Climate Treaty? What's going to happen when Britain is not at the table at the European Union showing that leadership?
I would slightly challenge the Honourable Member for Kingston on this point about investment. He will know that investment can be quite lumpy. It depends on when you're actually having an auction round. And also, we are buying far more with less because of the price of renewables has fallen so much. So actually, we're paying far less per unit of renewable energy. And I was very struck, though, by when we launched the offshore wind sector deal, how terming out that market does provide investment certainty. And I think there is a real lesson to be learned there in other technologies. I don't accept the point that without the EU at the table, the UK at the table, we will no longer be able to push the EU and other countries. We will continue to have a loud voice in this area and continue to lead from the front.
Minister agree that no matter how strongly people feel about this, they don't have the right to block roads or to encourage students to take unauthorised absences from school.
To peacefully protest is a fundamental part of our democracy, but I do think that forcing people to not take energy-efficient public transport on their way home, creating disruption for those going on a hard-earned holiday, and actually causing our excellent police force to perhaps give up some of their leave over Easter, and I do want to pay tribute to the police force, should make people think long and hard about the tactics that they're using.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Minister regularly takes me to task for not being positive enough about her government, so I'm going to surprise her. I am going to overlook the fracking and the expansion of Heathrow Airport and the new coal field up in Cumbria and say that when it comes to global climate work, the government is doing good work. But even there, it is undermined by the work of the UK Export Credit Agency, which is giving so much, billions of pounds, to more oil and gas exploration in some of the poorest countries. So will she surprise me in turn by saying she will do something about that?
Well, I have to say, this is a wonderful day to have the Honourable Lady being positive about the work not just my government but the whole of the UK is doing. She raises an important point about this challenge of investment. We of course support those industries who are highly productive and who do generate jobs and revenue. She will know that one of the things we're looking at is to ensure that we are not supporting, for example, coal mining in a way going forward. So we will continue to look at this, but we also have to make sure that when we are supporting exports, they are those that are delivering revenues and jobs for the exchequer, so we can continue to invest in the low-carbon revolution.
Lopez.
Deputy Speaker, I think there's a genuine public appetite to protect the environment, but it's not always clear to people where to direct their efforts, which is where the government is has such an important role in incentivising behavioural change. Can the Minister advise how she's trying to harness that public appetite by better signposting people to ways in which they can do their bit, and how they might help her in lobbying other countries who have been less successful in reducing their emissions?
The Honourable Lady hopefully heard the announcement. We'll have our second Green Great Britain Week, which is a brilliant week-long opportunity from the 4th of October where we can say what we've done, challenge others to do more and work right across the country. But I would hope the whole country would recognise that if we are able to win the bid to host the climate change talks, not only will it be an amazing chance for us to help the world move to decarbonisation, it would also be an incredible opportunity to showcase some of our best green technologies and businesses, and hopefully people will realise the benefit that comes from these investments in terms of jobs and growth.
Richard.
Mr. Speaker, would the Minister agree with me that we should all hang our heads in shame? The great political parties, and we as members of these parties, have not done enough. And we should be ashamed that it took a little Swedish girl to come here today and tell us that we need a sense of urgency and leadership, and to recognise that we must act sooner rather than later to stop this threat that will destroy this fragile planet. Wouldn't she agree with me? We should have listened to the scientists years ago. 25 years ago, I started CERA, a campaigning organisation in my party. We should have listened to the scientists then. We still are not listening to them clearly and closely enough now.
Well, we should have been listening to the scientists in 1950 when this first link was found. But I think what has been important about Ms Thunberg's visits today, and amazing to see the work, is this conversation has gone from a niche conversation held between people who, like me, have been long-standing interests in this area, to actually a mainstream conversation where everybody is talking about what is it that we need to do. And I think that is why this is such a challenge, but is so important. For the first time, the whole country is talking about climate change, and I believe the whole world is talking about climate change and how we stop it. There are no deniers on these benches. No.
Shareholders.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The UK has a good and proven track record in meeting the challenges of climate change, from the passing of the Climate Change Act in 2008 to the emergence of world-leading industry in offshore wind, which is bringing significant benefits to my constituency. That said, we can do more. Does my right honourable friend agree that we need to dramatically reduce carbon emissions from our existing housing stock, which will tackle the scourge of fuel poverty? And will she consider recognising housing as a key component of national infrastructure?
Well done. Well done. My honourable friend has been a marvellous champion of renewable energy, and it was a delight to launch the Offshore wind sector deal in Lowestoft and see the regeneration that it is bringing to that proud port. He's right to talk about retrofitting homes. I sat on the Green Deal Bill Committee, as many others did. We thought we had an answer there. It didn't work. We have to keep going. We actually have to recognise that things like green mortgage lending could pay an important contribution. And hopefully he'll be pleased to see that we've taken the whole of the eco-budget and focused it on fuel poverty, and also up the innovation component, because we need to have innovation in the homes retrofitting area, particularly to drive costs down.
Ms McInnes.
There seems to be precious little action on achieving the Aichi biodiversity targets. The UK is only on track to achieve 5 of these 20 targets by 2020. So can I ask the Minister what action she intends to take in order to rectify this woeful situation? Very good.
I'm afraid the Honourable Lady is challenging the breadth of my knowledge on this. I'd be delighted. It's clear it's not my department's area, but I would be very happy to engage further. And I think she points out that we can no longer talk about climate and ocean and biodiversity as sort of separate silos. We have to join them up. So I would look forward to a conversation where perhaps she could educate me more on that point.
Philip Honourable.
Authoritative research from Carbon Brief shows that the UK has cut CO2 emissions now to the lowest level since 1888. That in the last 7 years, the decline in CO2 emissions has been the fastest sustained fall in history, and since 1990, the UK has cut carbon emissions faster than any other major economy in the world. Aren't all three very proud achievements of this government?
And I know the Honourable Gentleman's Honourable Friend's constituents in Kettering are amongst the most green-minded in the country, as he often points out to us, but he points out an important fact that yes, we have more to do, but we should be really proud of these facts, these achievements we've made. People thought this would be impossible, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it is possible, it is achievable, and we will continue to do more.
Samuel Wilson.
Despite the views of many in this House that government action can control and fine-tune the complex world climate, the fact of the matter is that climate change is a natural phenomenon. We have experienced it throughout the history of the world, and we'll experience it in the future. And a small part of that is greenhouse gas emissions, 97% of which are natural, caused by water vapour, volcanic activity, decaying vegetation. 3% caused by man. 1% of that is caused by the United Kingdom. A very, very small percentage. And yet we have changed our economy dramatically. And while the Minister has outlined the achievements of the government, she hasn't pointed out that we pay dear for energy bills and have fuel poverty, have lost tens of thousands of jobs in energy-intensive industries, while at the same time, while we're setting these targets, nature and our competitors are offsetting our draconian actions.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman would not be surprised to know that I disagree with his scientific analysis. I think that the link between CO2 emissions and temperature increases is proven to an extent well beyond the proof that smoking causes lung cancer. And I think the challenge he rightly raises, though, is how do you act in a way that is just and fair and ensure that you don't put people out of work and you don't put bills up. Now, the government goes through a process of making sure our energy-intensive industries are held whole, they don't overpay for their energy. We all supported a price cap bill to ensure that the cost of energy is held down. But ultimately, this is why when we act, we have to act in a proportionate way and make sure that whoever ends up having to pay for these, whether it is customers or taxpayers or shareholders, is paying a fair and proportionate amount.
Sarah Newton.
Deputy Speaker, Cornwall and the wider South West has clean growth at the heart of our local and regional industrial strategy. Many innovative businesses will be delivering the solutions we need to decarbonise. So will the Minister publish the Green Finance strategy when she publishes her response to the Climate Change Committee's recommendations? Because like her, I think market forces can be forces for good.
I will look into that, and I do, again, Cornwall is wonderful for many things, but this adoption of clean growth as a fundamental part of a local industrial strategy is incredibly exciting, and we do want to see other areas doing the same.
Clive Efford.
Mr Deputy Speaker, in answer to my honourable friend from Innis Mon, the Minister said that she liked local innovation, but refused to direct any resources, as he was calling, for improving the built environment in local communities. So can the Minister say just exactly what is it? What resources will local authorities have access to in order to carry out the innovation that she's talking about?
Well, I neglected to mention the £8 million of money we've put into local energy partnerships. What we often find is local authorities have lots of ambition but don't necessarily have the skills, and we want to make sure that they do have those skills and they have the investment. And I also referenced the Salix pot, which is available for very many of the local authority, local government buildings that are also an important part of the local built environment.
Ross.
Mr Deputy Speaker, solar energy plays a crucial role in this issue, and last month I met with the Minister and Murray-based AES Solar when they explained their concerns about the cliff edge the industry was facing because of a change in policy. More than 3 weeks later, that policy gap still exists. Now, I'm sure the Minister accepts the urgency of this issue, so can she tell us when the Government will publish its Smart Export Guarantee policy?
Possible, and I do thank my honourable friend for that meeting. What he will also know is that we are seeing energy companies voluntarily bringing forward now effectively smart export guarantee prices. So we are already seeing those price signals coming through. We want to make sure, as I said, that we get it right and we don't have to go back as we did with feed-in tariffs and realise that we will have committed over £30 billion, as we will have done over the lifetime of that scheme, to deliver a relatively small number of installations. We want to make the smart export guarantee future-proofed and make it stick.
The Secretary of State mentioned in a statement that the Government has sought the advice of the Committee on Climate Change on a net zero target. Now, should this advice entail a greater investment in low-carbon innovation than the £2.5 billion detailed in the Clean Growth Strategy, can the Secretary of State reassure the House that the Government will commit additional funding as necessary?
The gentleman was inviting me to make funding bids to my colleagues in the Treasury. Of course, I would want to make that bid. I think innovation funding and co-partnership on innovation is actually a huge success and one that we do need to do to drive costs down and drive up deployment.
I don't think any of us, Mr Deputy Speaker, can doubt the energy and the determination of the Minister in dealing with this issue. But if I could encourage her to take an hour off a week and watch the fabulous Channel 4 documentary The Street, about the very innovative way in which Cherwell District Council is allowing people to self-build houses in Bicester, I think she would be as surprised as I was, Mr Speaker, in the way that eco-credentials become very, very important when you build your own home. Would she watch this documentary? It's Kevin MacLeod. It won't hurt her, I assure you. And could she think more carefully about how we encourage people and local councils to really embed eco-values when they build?
Minister.
I think the Honourable Lady points up an incredibly important fact, that is, people want to do the right thing. They often don't know where to go. And frankly, centrally imposed standards often suppress rather than stimulate innovation, and trying to get that right, I know, is the subject of a review in other departments at the moment, but perhaps Honourable Lady could pour me a glass of organic wine and we could watch it together.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I asked the Minister earlier about what she'll do to incentivise all renewables and got a very narrow answer, so let me try again. Small-scale renewables such as solar panels have been fitted in developments in my constituency, such as the social rented housing one in Pollock Shields by Home Group. But Hannah Smith of Scottish Renewables has said that the end of the feed-in tariff will mean, at best, a period of enormous uncertainty for the companies that install these projects and for the people who work for them. The solar sector in Scotland installed the equivalent of 360,000 solar panels every year since 2010. It is no small industry. What will she do to restore certainty and incentivise that industry?
Well, I think the lady makes the point, an important point, that we need to hurry up with the smart export guarantee and make sure it does work to deliver that. But I would encourage her gently to look at the outcome that we are delivering with, rather than focusing on a particular technology. You know, last month we were at over 40% renewable energy in the UK, and we are now able to source things like offshore wind at subsidy-free prices. So we are delivering. We will continue to deliver. We need to do that in a good way in terms of value for money for consumers.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Bristol was one of the, I think it was the first city in the UK to declare a climate emergency. And can I now put on the record that Bristol would be more than willing to host the COP talks if we do win the bid? I can think of nowhere better. But can I ask particularly, and that's a joint bid by myself and the Honourable Member for Bristol West, but can I ask specifically about Sustainable Development Goal 12, which is on responsible production and consumption? Because it seems to me we're using far too many of the world's natural resources, producing things that we don't actually need, just in the interests of keeping money flowing from buyers and sellers and so on. What can we do to actually make sure that limit that circle and use our natural resources more wisely?
Well said. Well, as a Nailsy girl, I would of course be biased in terms of supporting a Bristol bid. I suspect it'll be a whole of UK bid. But the Honourable Lady makes an important point, and I think we have made progress on the so-called sustainable economy. We will continue to do so. It requires government action alongside producers. And again, we are trying to lead by example, but clearly there is much more to do. I also would challenge her. I think that climate change runs through 15 of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's actually fundamental to almost all of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Paul Blomfield.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the Minister is absolutely right to talk about the need for more action at an international level. But can she explain how she intends to use the bid for COP26 to achieve that, and specifically spell out the more ambitious targets that she thinks the world should embrace?
Let's try and win it first, because there are other countries bidding, and I want to make sure that if we do get it, we're able to offer appropriate leadership in that space. So maybe we could have that conversation in a few months' time.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Mayor of Greater Manchester published his Clean Air Plan earlier this year, which I welcome, but we need help from government to deliver it, specifically in funding for a vehicle scrappage scheme and for retrofitting our bus fleet. What assurances can the Minister give us that funding will be made available to us?
I do want to commend, it's a good example of the work that can be done in pulling through these changes. We have increased our support across the country for the transition to zero-emission vehicles to over 1.5 billion now, both in terms of charging points, in terms of some support for buyers, and in terms of this transition to clean mass public transport. Again, I'd welcome conversations both with the Honourable Lady and also with other colleagues from other departments, because if we are going to accelerate this, we need to do it in areas where it will really make a difference to air quality first.
Paul Swick.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The nature of this emergency necessitates a national mission-orientated approach. In the same way that the Americans had a national mission in the 1960s to put a man on the moon, we need the same sort of vigorous approach to do this. And that requires the government to be much more proactive and much more active in its approach to bringing forward the technologies, de-risking the technologies and launching them into the wider marketplace in our economy. A great example of the failure currently is in the offshore renewable sector, where we've got bifab yards in Scotland currently lying idle with no certainty over their future because this government is failing to grip the issue of creating a level playing field, as well as the Scottish Government's failure on that as well. For example, Navantia, the Spanish shipbuilder, is currently benefiting from 35% subsidies from the Spanish Government. This Government is taking no action to level the playing field. We are being ripped off by other companies with competitor nations that are stealing our technologies and also undermining our industrial base. What is the Minister going to do about it?
I do understand the bifab situation. I've discussed it extensively. I do have to gently correct the Honourable Gentleman, because part of the offshore wind sector deal included a commitment to ensure that the UK content, actual real content, would go up to 60%, and there would be not just IP but actual content as well, and there would actually be a much better audit process, because I'm aware of the claims that he has made, and we have to ensure we do have a level playing field when we're essentially committing taxpayer funding to develop this industry further.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. A letter has been signed by myself and Councillor Tudor Owens, leader of Plymouth City Council, co-signed by 65 young people aged from 3 to 17 who attended the climate strike outside the Council's offices in Plymouth. If they were to listen to this debate, they would have heard nothing from the Minister about agreeing to declare a climate emergency. So on behalf of all those young people, they would want me to ask the Minister, please just declare a climate emergency, work cross-party and show those young people that the government is listening to them.
I'm sorry if that's the impression. I mean, I can't say it again. We need actions, not just words. It is the easiest thing in the world to stand up with a document and say, look, here is our plan. Unless there are actions, unless you can deliver them, unless we can show those young people we're prepared to put our money where our mouth is, then we should all just pack up and go home. Well, I'm not going home. I'm going to keep campaigning on the climate change, and I'm sure the Honourable Gentleman is too.
Patrick Gray.
Deputy Speaker, school pupils at primary level in Kelvindale and Hillhead, at secondary level in Glasgow Academy and Glasgow University have all been part of these climate protests, and they understand the importance of tackling it, not just here at home but around the world. So I want to ask the Minister if she's committed to the principle of climate justice and supporting in particular people in developing countries who are feeling the effects of climate change first and hardest but who've done least to cause it. So when the government provides the kind of support that she's mentioned, if that money is being counted towards the overseas development assistance target, can she assure us that that money is being spent in developing countries and not subsidising other government work happening here?
Incredibly important point, and in fact we should actually be really proud of the way that we do spend funding. Not only are we trying to ensure that we're funding adaptation and mitigation, we're actually trying to invest in projects that help other countries sort of leapfrog some of the things we've done, for example rely on a coal-based energy system, and projects from Brazil where we're supporting reforestation to renewables in Africa. It is really making a difference. It's providing employment, it's providing skills, and it's ensuring we have that just transition that the Honourable Gentleman has mentioned.
Matthew Pinker.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I join others in acknowledging the progress made under successive governments, but the truth is that unless the status of emissions reduction is raised within this government, and the UK's response to climate crisis driven vigorously from the centre so that all departments are forced to act, will continue to fall short. With that in mind, can I ask the Minister for her assessment of how well prepared she thinks the institutions of government are currently for the scale and pace of the transition required?
Well, I have to say, I think part of the challenge, but also part of the opportunity, is this has to be a cross-government process. You simply can't sit and make policy around transport emissions without thinking about infrastructure. You can't talk about energy without thinking about, planning systems. And so there is absolutely a fundamental cross-government agreement on this, as well as hopefully cross-party. And I think it's telling that when we, for example, agreed to put forward our COP bid, which is a not insubstantial cost, but that was done with complete cabinet unanimity because everybody recognises the importance of this and how fundamentally how every part of our economy has to change.
Helen Giffen.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. At the beginning of her statement, the Minister began by saying how good the Climate Change Act 10 years ago was because it put legal obligations on the government. One of the interesting things that Greta Thunberg said earlier today was that we needed to move from the politically possible to the scientifically necessary. Now, the high point of political possibility was reached at Paris, but as my right honourable friend, the member for Doncaster North, pointed out, that is not enough. That is not delivering the goods. So when the Minister goes back into the international arena in Chile at the end of the year, will she think about promoting legal obligations and not just pledges at the international level?
I think the Honourable Lady is right that we have to act as well as just set out these warm words. One of the things we have been doing, and it is working, is encouraging other countries to pass their own climate legislation. So they're not just setting sort of interesting, politically attractive targets and then all going off and having lunch. They're actually putting in law the sorts of budgets and the sorts of reduction trajectories that we have had to do, which means that ministers have to stand up and have these uncomfortable grillings in front of people who know a lot more about the subject than they do.
Lady Howden.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. Minister, I was particularly struck by one sentence. I listened very carefully to your statement, but there was one sentence that actually stood out above the others, and that was, and I'm quoting, Minister, we should be proud that here in the UK we have shown real leadership. That was the particular sentence that I latched onto. And I did so because, as the Minister will know, we have no functioning assembly in Northern Ireland and we have no Environment Minister in Northern Ireland, nor have we had one since January of 2017. So for over 2 years we've not had an Environment Minister in Northern Ireland. So I need to know, and I'm sure my colleagues here also need to know, that there's been real leadership in Northern Ireland in terms of carbon emissions in the absence of a functioning assembly, and that of course must mean that the Minister and her officials have worked very closely indeed with the Northern Ireland Department responsible for this issue. Can the Minister offer me that reassurance and tell me some of the details of that work?
Indeed, I can offer the Honourable Lady that assurance. I mean, we have had, I have a regular ministerial quadrilaterals, and in this case it is with the civil servants who do an excellent job representing Northern Ireland on many issues, including climate change progress and including preparation for deal or no deal planning. So the system is working. Obviously, we would like to see, political leadership as well in Northern Ireland, but the process is working and the market mechanisms that have been put in place are delivering the CO2 reductions that we would want to see.
Thank you, Deputy.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And the Honourable lady may be sick of hearing me ask the same question over and over again, so I'll try and ask it in a different way. She says that she wants action and not words, and I agree with her. The two are not mutually exclusive. She comes up with lots of ideas, and there's lots, as she said, in the various documents she refers to. So why not have actions and words? Because powerful words often lead to much more powerful action. It is an emergency. There is a sense of urgency which today's young people feel. They need to see that leadership coming from within this room. Please, will she think again and declare a climate emergency?
The Honourable Lady will get the same answer. Look, it doesn't. She gets points for persistency. I'm still waiting, by the way, for my vegan meal delivered to the House of Parliament. But the point still stands. It doesn't matter what we all stand up and say. It's what we stand up and do, what we go out of here and do. And I know the Honourable Lady is passionate about this, both on behalf of her constituents and the country she's proud to represent. We are delivering. We will continue to deliver. And I want to be the minister that actually commits us to a course of action, not just a slogan that sounds good on a T-shirt.
Thank you, Mr Deputy. The Minister is absolutely right to focus on actions. The government's own analysis is that the introduction of E10 would take the equivalent of 1 million vehicles off the road. That's the government's own analysis. It's something that could be done now. So will she, as one of her actions, immediately speak to her colleagues in the Department for Transport and get them to accelerate the move to E10?
Yes.
Right, we now come to the motion on Northern Ireland. Minister to move.